All right, good morning and welcome to TMC Financing's webinar regarding SBA 504 projects with improvements. My name is Rich Grant and among other things I manage the sales team for TMC Financing. Joining me today is Deanna Arnold, Closing Department Manager for TMC. The purpose of our webinar today is to inform you of process updates in projects which involve improvements in order for the SBA 504 loan to be funded in a timely and efficient manner. TMC approves and funds more than 200 SBA 504 loans every year, and a significant number of these projects involve improvements or construction. You have available to you significant resources and experience in the form of your TMC team, including your business development officer, underwriter, and closing team. By way of background, in our most recent SBA audit, SBA provided specific guidance as to what documentation must be in our loan file. It is important to note that none of the required documents themselves have changed. This webinar is an effort for us to share with our valuable lending partners our recent experiences with SBA in order to fund your SBA 504 loan as quickly as possible. That's how we all make money, by funding quality loans. Before we get started, let me run through some logistics. This webinar will run no more than 30 minutes, including questions. We definitely want to be mindful of your busy schedules, and I'm sure that many of you are planning to listen in to NADCO's webinar on SBA 504 refinance immediately following this. At the end of the presentation, we will have a few minutes to answer questions live. If we're unable to take all questions live, or if you prefer to take your answer offline, we will follow up with you after the webinar. With that, we'll get started, and over to you, Deanna.
Good morning. I'm Deanna Arnold, the Closing Department Manager at TMC Financing. So let's dive in. What's new? We have two things that have changed. The first thing that has changed is when the construction documents are submitted to SBA for review. As Rich mentioned, the required documents have not changed. In the past, the construction documents were reviewed by SBA if a complete file review is called. A complete file review is called on 5% or a minimum of one review per every 20 loans funded in a fiscal year. Now, these construction documents are reviewed when every construction loan is submitted to SBA for funding. What else has changed? The second thing that changed is the documentation the CDC must have on file to prove payment to the contractors and the vendors. In the past, if the lender dispersed payment to the contractor, we could rely on the lender's disbursement list that showed how funds were allocated along with execution of the SBA interim lender certification form. Now SBA wants to see the trail of payment to the contractor or the vendor. We must be in receipt of documentation that shows what was paid, who was paid, and how they were paid. The required documentation is needed in order for the CDC, lender, and borrower to meet the SBA funding conditions that are outlined in the SBA authorization and in the CDC, interim lender, and borrower certification forms that get submitted to SBA. The SBA required documentation is the same regardless if the bank or borrower funds paid for the improvements, or if the improvements were completed by the borrower prior to SBA application. It's TMC's responsibility to close the loan in accordance with the authorization to certify that all project costs are paid in full and that the amounts match the approved authorization. TMC must collect supporting documentation to meet their responsibility. In addition, TMC is required to include an executed CDC certification form when the loan is submitted to SBA for funding. The lender is also required to make certifications to SBA. They do so by providing the payment backup documentation that is requested by TMC and by signing the SBA interim lender certification form. These are some of the key certifications. The interim loan is dispersed per the authorization. The borrower has contributed cash, land, or other property required. If the interim loan includes construction financing, project has been completed in accordance with the final plans and specifications. The lender has no knowledge of any unremedied substantial adverse change in the condition. And the borrower's current honest payments is not otherwise in default. The borrower and operating company make certifications that all project costs are paid in full by providing the payment documentation that is requested by TMC. The borrower and the operating company are also required to execute the SBA Borrower and Operating Company Certification Form. As previously mentioned, this form is included when the loan is submitted to SBA for debenture funding. Here is the SBA timeline from application to debenture funding. First, the SBA approval of the project improvements comes in. The licensed contractor had provided bids and an appraisal was submitted to SBA. Next, the permits are confirmed with the city and obtained. Work that does not meet the city requirements cannot be included in the SBA project. TMC will confirm city permit requirements prior to funding. The improvements are complete and inspected by the city. A final inspection sign-off and a certificate of occupancy is issued. Contractors and their invoices are all paid in full. The evidence shows who, how, and what was paid. Finally, the mechanics lien period is up, and the title company is now in a position to issue SBA a lien-free insurance policy. Here is an example of what SBA wants to see on a construction loan where the lender handled payment. The bid here is by a licensed contractor, and it contains a detailed breakdown of what makes up the cost. This allows TMC and any CDC to determine if they are all SBA eligible costs. When the construction cost is 1/3 of purchase price or fair market value, the appraisal must include the as-complete value to meet the SBA requirement. However, oftentimes when a lender is ordering the appraisal, they will request as-complete value even on smaller improvement projects. Once the improvements are complete, evidence is required to show the SBA requirements have been met. The final inspection or certificate of occupancy is issued, a notice of completion gets filed, an appraisal recertification letter is issued, seismic regulations are in compliance, occupancy is met. The 60% occupancy by the operating company is required for new ground-up construction. The operating company may lease long-term up to 20% and temporarily lease an additional 20% with the intention of using some of the additional 20% within 3 years and all of it within 10 years. The final inspection sign-off or the certificate of occupancy shows that improvements complied with the governmental permit and licensing requirements. Permits were pulled, and once the work was complete, it was inspected by the city inspector who issued a certificate of occupancy. A notice of completion was filed within 15 days after the certificate of occupancy was issued, and it was filed correctly. Why file a notice of completion? It shortens the time period which contractors and subcontractors have to file mechanics liens on the project. If not filed or incorrectly filed, they have 90 days. Even though the California and Nevada Civil Code imposes a deadline on contractors and subcontractors to file mechanics liens against the property, it does not mandate that the title company issue a lien-free policy. It is within the title company's discretion to determine what is a reasonable lien period, regardless of when the notice of completion was filed. In more volatile economic times, you may see a lengthening of the waiting period for a title company to issue that lien-free policy. So how can the SBA loan fund prior to the lien period expiring? The average lien period is 90 days from completion. However, due to some other variables in the law, the title companies may need to wait 6 months to a year to issue a lien-free ALTA policy, regardless if a notice of completion is filed. In order to close the SBA loan prior to that period of time being up, the title company must approve an indemnity. Documents typically required for review by the title company are financials, construction breakdown with proof of payment and invoices, final unconditional lien releases from contractors and subcontractors, and an executed indemnity agreement by the borrower. The executed indemnity agreement ensures the title company will not be held responsible for any losses or damages as a result of future liens. TMC Financing works with the borrower and the lender to collect this information and will provide the title company with the necessary documents. If the improvements are 1/3 of the purchase price or fair market value, a recertification letter is required from the appraiser stating that the building was built with only minor deviations, if any, from the plans and specs upon which the original estimate of value was based. If the improvements have not been completed as planned, it is requested that the appraiser describe any impact this has on their opinion of market value. Typically, the lender is who engages the appraiser, so we will need your assistance in order to obtain the document once the improvements are complete. In the construction of a new building or in addition to an existing building, the construction must conform with the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program recommended provisions for the development of seismic regulations for new buildings, or a building code the SBA has identified as having substantially equivalent provisions. TMC provides a template letter for the architect, engineer, or contractor to execute. Here is an example of that template. In this particular loan, the disbursement backup included the bank's cashier's check to the contractor, unconditional lien releases for progress payment, the contractor's invoice, and the contractor's progress billing. As mentioned earlier, the CDC must be able to see who, how, and what was paid for. The CDC must see the trail of payment from the lender to the contractor or the vendor. The contractor progression billing allowed us to see exactly how the funds were used. CDC is required to certify funds are used on SBA eligible costs. Provide TMC with your final use of funds spreadsheets that show how funds were applied, that you have fully dispersed funds, and what your final loan amounts are. In this next example, improvements solely consisted of installation of solar panels. In this case, the bank dispersed the funds to the borrower, and the borrower paid the contractor directly. Again, the estimate was from a licensed contractor, and this estimate provided a clear detail of what made up the cost and the total amount due. Permits were required. When the work was done, a final inspection sign-off was issued by the city inspector. Because of the minor scope of work in this case, a certificate of occupancy was not required. The final inspection document was it. The contractor's invoice in this case details what payment was for, who was paid, and again, the amount paid. In this case, proof of payment came in the form of an unconditional lien release issued by the contractor for each payment made. An indemnity agreement was required for title to issue the lien-free ALTA policy. The scope of work does not matter. TMC is here to help you. We will be by your side throughout the construction project. We are here to educate, guide, and assist you and the borrower through the process. You can reach out to your TMC business development officer, loan officer, or closing officer anytime. We can review reimbursement documentation provided by the contractor or lender before you have disbursed funds to ensure that it meets the SBA evidence requirements. We will review requests for project cost increase or change in use of funds to ensure SBA eligibility. We will submit changes to SBA for approval and advocate on behalf of the borrower. So how can funding delays be prevented? Include TMC in project construction process. Confirm the permit requirements. As mentioned earlier, work that did not meet the city requirements cannot be included in the SBA project. Control disbursements of funds whenever possible. Track who, how, and what was paid. File the notice of completion correctly and in time. Obtain unconditional lien releases from the contractors and subcontractors. At the time of engagement, let the appraiser know you will need a certification after the improvements are complete. And let the contractor know that improvements must conform with seismic regulations. Thank you for your time this morning. I am now going to pass the baton back to Rich Grant.
Thanks, Deanna. Actually, want to slide back to the previous. This slide just walks through some of the typical project costs, eligible project costs involved in SBA 504 projects, including construction, soft costs, professional fees, etc. We do a number of transactions that are equipment-only transactions in the 504 program, so that's certainly an option as well. We've done some that are solar-only. So again, this is not meant to be fully inclusive, but just an example of some of the SBA 504 eligible project costs. So in terms of additional resources, I would say that this list is certainly not intended to be all-inclusive, but starting with the SBA SOP, which will be updated again shortly. We've got the interim lender certification that Deanna mentioned in the presentation. The SBA authorization, which really drives how the loan is documented on the SBA side. We've got a list of frequently asked questions on our website at tmcfinancing.com. We also rely upon resources like Starfield and Smith, who are known as SBA legal experts, NADCO, Nagel, and others. I would say definitely the SOP is probably one of the most significant resources mentioned here. And again, look at TMC Financing's website as a resource also. I would say, without question, utilize your resources. Most importantly, in terms of shameless plug, I would say remember TMC for your next SBA 504 loan. Before we take questions, I do want to mention that a recorded version of the presentation will be available for your viewing pleasure. Please contact us if you're interested. I'm not sure if there's any questions at this point in time. Again, as you note on the screen, you can either type your question into the question box. I think we've answered the first question. And if you don't want to take the question live, you can email us, email me, and we will get back to you collectively. I'll give you guys a couple minutes and then we'll sign off and move on to the next webinar. In the event that we have no questions, we will sign off for now. Again, please do feel free to email if you have any questions. And we have a note again. We will be happy to share a copy of this recorded webinar with you and the slide deck for your reference. Thanks very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you.